We are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings, secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
How's everybody doing? Welcome to Conspiracy Corner Podcast. This is Abe, your host, speaking. Hope everyone's doing okay today. I'm actually running on about 4 hours of sleep, so I am exhausted. I worked all last night, but I didn't really get much sleep before my shift. I don't know if you all have ever experienced this moving into a new apartment, but it's hard to go to sleep like the first night or first day you stay there. There's actually like a scientific reason. Basically, like they say it's almost like a defense mechanism that's ingrained in us that pretty much half your brain only gets rest and then the other half gets rest. It takes turns instead of like your full brain resting at once. I guess almost like a defensive in case an emergency happens, you can like get up real quick and you're kind of halfway asleep. So hopefully I get some better sleep. I've just been moving some stuff out of the storage unit. Honestly, me and Sam put a pretty good dent in it. I'd say we put about 1/3 in, or took out 1/3 of what's in the storage unit. So that's pretty much all that's going on in my life right now. Just let me know what you guys have been thinking about the podcast so far. Hope you all have been enjoying them. Today I'm going to do a little interview that I found in that book, The New UFO Sightings. It's an interview with Glenn McWane and John A. Keel. And for anyone who doesn't know who John A. Keel is, basically he's the author of Mothman Prophecies. Mothman Prophecies is probably like one of the best books I've ever read. The book is like 10 times different than the movie. I think 10 times better than the movie. As weird as the movie is, the book is 10 times weirder. So yeah, if you've never seen the movie, check it out. It's not horrible. It's nothing like the book. So don't really watch the movie expecting it to be like super true story, you know. They changed a lot of stuff, but that's Hollywood for you. But yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and read this little interview for y'all. Glenn McWane. John, how do you feel about UFOs getting some national publicity after a rather long hiatus on the part of the media? John A. Keel. It is very interesting. Tonight on the NBC News, they reported some of these sightings. They mentioned that a woman somewhere in the South not only saw a UFO, but on the side of the object, the letters UFO were painted. It was an amusing anecdote for the newscast, but I expect this is true. This was an ultimate joke. We may be getting more reports like this. A few years ago, I talked with two young men who had seen an object in a field that resembled exactly one of our space modules and had said U.S. Air Force printed on the sides. But of course, one of our space modules isn't going to be hovering over a field in New Jersey. I never wrote it up because even the UFO buffs wouldn't believe it. I wouldn't be so sure of that, John. In my opinion, I don't believe we went to the moon, so there's actually like satellite pictures and stuff of Mars rovers and stuff like that on basically the middle of the desert out west and stuff, you know. So that's probably what those people came across was NASA faking some stuff, in my opinion. As for the coverage this flap is getting, it is superb. UPI is doing excellent wrap-up stories on it. The NBC newscast has been covering it every night this week and every night last week. This may be because NBC is preparing a white paper on UFOs. 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was called by a young man who is working on it, and we had dinner together. It is being produced by Fred Freed, who produced a number of award-winning white papers. In the course of my conversation a month ago with these people, I laid out some predictions based on the patterns of previous flaps. I really put my neck out. All of my predictions are coming true. I was able to tell them that the sightings would be concentrated in the Mississippi Valley and move up to Ohio Valley by the end of October. They are seen everywhere, but the heaviest concentration seems to be in the Mississippi Valley. According to my statistics, around or on October 21st is the day when the biggest flaps are likely to occur. Of course, the 24th produces some interesting manifestations. This year, October 24, is on a Wednesday, and I wouldn't be surprised if the UFO flap will peak on that day, then gradually start to subside. We will have a brief low, and then next March, all hell is going to break loose. McWayne. Why do you think all this UFO activity is taking place now? Keel. I keep trying to outguess the phenomenon, but it is hard. Because it is always one step ahead of you. On a number of occasions, when I'm most active in my research, I would go to an obscure farm on an obscure back road to research a story that had never been publicized. As soon as I would walk into the house, the phone would start to go crazy, but no one would be on the other end of the line, and the farmer would be amazed because this had never happened before. If you've all seen the Mothman Prophecies, the movie, you realize Richard Gere is the character who plays John A. Keel. But the telephone basically plays a big part in that movie. He keeps getting all these random calls in the middle of the night at strange hours with whispers or breathing on the other side. In the movie, they make it like phone calls from Indrid Cold, which is basically like an alien. The book is different. Indrid Cold and Mothman are two separate entities in the book. In the movie, they kind of warped it into one. Like, he sees Mothman, and then Mothman will change into Indrid Cold, and that's not how it's supposed to be. But yeah, if you read the book too, he gets he has crazy phone calls from m.i.b, just random craziness when it comes to the telephone in general. This occurred several times in several different places. Someone was trying to get through to me that they knew every move I was making. They finally convinced me. McWayne. Speaking of personal investigations, wherein it appears that a mysterious unidentified someone is keeping an eye on things. A few years ago, I was involved in researching a case in which a particular UFO contactee claimed to have been given vast hordes of advanced scientific information. This man, I'll call him Salvatore, claims that he knows where terrestrial UFO bases are located. Keel. You must be aware that this very thing has been repeated 50 or 100 times around the country or around the world. Do you remember the famous Mel Noel case of the 1960s? He claimed that a group of earthly scientists based in Brazil were building UFOs. He had a good following, and people came to believe in him. Then he just disappeared into thin air. Someone did write to me about a year ago and said Mel Noel had turned up again. They had to talk to him and heard him lecture. Noel apparently had a lot of money behind him. He came to New York City, went to Life magazine, went to Mort Young, who was then with the Journal American. Noel was signing people up to go on a space flight. He collected photos of all these different reporters for their space passports. Mel Noel was very good looking, extremely well dressed. He was accompanied by not one, but 2 or 3 or more very attractive girls who looked like movie stars from the descriptions I have. He traveled all around the country stirring people up. He had a story very similar to yours, Salvatore's. Sorry. A lot of people with such claims get in touch with me because they think I'm going to believe their story, become enthusiastic about it, and write a glowing article about it. It is very difficult for me to tell them how I feel sorry for them, that I have heard it all before, and that I see them going down the road to ruin just as several others have done in the past. I believe that a lot of people who have written strange letters to me have really been mediumistic channels, and that the letters were produced by automatic writing. There was a case a few years ago in which I interviewed some witnesses on Long Island. It was a family that had seen some rather remarkable things. I taped the interview in the living room with 3 or 4 people. A year or 2 later, I went back and I dropped in on them to see how they had been doing and if anything new was happening. They didn't know me. They were amazed. I started telling them about UFO experiences and they thought I was crazy. They had no memory of all the things they had been told that they had told me about a year ago. This is crazy. That reminds me honestly of like I don't know, this is just me personally, but that kind of reminds me of the Men in Black movies, you know. Maybe it's like predictive programming, maybe. The movies are predictive programming or subtle disclosure. Basically saying that they wiped this family's memory clean, you know. That's just one theory. It's a personal theory. I mean, this is Conspiracy Corner podcast, so I guess you could say it's a conspiracy theory that perhaps the Men in Black wiped this whole family's memory clean, you know. They were not acting as if they were hiding anything or putting me on. They were nearly at a point of shock. McWayne. Does this lead us into a sinister Men in Black kind of phenomenon? Keel. Perhaps. Not too long ago, a photographer showed me a lot of pictures he had taken at an outdoor rock festival in England. There was something very extraordinary about the picture. There was a large crowd, and scattered in the crowd were 3 men who looked like brothers. Their hair was quite short in contrast to the other people in the picture. They were dressed identically, and they all had this man in black look. Not an oriental look, but a gaunt, evil look. They were widely separated in the crowd, and yet if you brought these 3 men together, they would have looked like triplets. This doesn't prove anything, except that the picture fascinated me. In January 1969, during Nixon's first inauguration, I was very interested to notice 3 men in black suits, looking very much like our classical Men in Black, sitting together a few rows from the front, right behind Nixon. When he gave his inaugural address, every time the television camera shot Nixon from a particular angle, I could see these 3 men. They seemed out of place. Of course, they could have been ambassadors from Vietnam or something. I wondered afterward if my imagination had been running away from me. I got a hold of all these magazines I could find with pictures of the inauguration, and I went over them with a magnifying glass, but I could not find those three guys. Yet I had seen them very clearly on my television. That's kind of crazy. That reminds me. I don't know. Hang on just a second. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this. Let me know in the comments if you have. But that reminds me of, there was a speech that Obama was doing. And it's actually on the internet, on YouTube. You could look it up. People have seen this bald, they think he's like a reptilian guy. And I've actually seen another video that he's in, and he is a very creepy looking guy. He looks almost like Indrid Cold or the Grinning Man, you know. When you see him in like a frontal view, you know what I mean? But I don't know, there's been these weird suited figures who have popped up over the years, you know, that just look out of place. They look alien or Men in Black, you know. McWayne, have you ever run into a Men in Black type that is skinny as you could ever imagine a living human to be? Keel, the thin man is well known to me. I call him the Cadaver. Over the years, I have had 25 different people describe the Cadaver to me. He is usually extremely pale, as if he were bloodless. He is so thin that he looks like he is going to fall apart at any moment. He is usually rather poorly dressed, but it isn't easy to look good in clothes when one is so thin. I don't know why that reminds me of like the creepy thin man from Charlie's Angels. What's his name? Crispin Glover. I love Crispin Glover. I don't know. In my opinion, I think he's a underrated actor, definitely. But yeah, I don't know. That's something I need to look into. The Cadaver or the Thin Man. I've never really heard of him until now. So let me know in the comments if you guys have ever heard anything about the Thin Man or anything like that. I'd be interested to hear. A man in Minnesota wrote to me recently about his problem with Men in Black. He called them morticians. He thought that their manner and their looks were like those of a mortician in an English comedy. He was seeing them all over his hometown. There are several areas to this whole weird business. On one hand, we have the real UFO phenomenon, strange lights passing over the earth, probably since time began. The UFO intelligences are aware that we are going to see the lights occasionally when the conditions are just right. So they just have to give us an explanation. Different generations have been given different explanations. These intelligences have staged whole events over a long period of time to support those explanations. We have had the fairy faith in Middle Europe. We have had the vampire and various other kinds of legends. We have had the mysterious airships of 1897. That right there is a crazy story. Look that up if you all have never heard about the airships of 1897. If it's the one I'm thinking of, it's basically like they've got paintings and stuff of it, and it's actually been written about in like history books of this, basically like a Star Wars spaceship battle that lasted for like I think like 2 or 3 days in medieval Europe, and the people just watched it go down pretty much. I'll probably do that, a podcast just on that, because it's crazy, it's insane, and it's just one of those things that you don't hear in the history books, you know. Now we have spaceships, but all of these things are nothing but a cover for the real phenomenon, whatever it is. On the ground as well as in the air, there are real things happening that they don't want us to know about. So they gave us lots of cover stories. The Men in Black support the cover stories in many of these instances. That reminds me of actually a scene in the movie. John A. Keel actually visits a character in the book who's a writer John A. Keel is actually depicted as Richard Gere's character, which is the main character. And then he's also depicted as this like crazy conspiracy writer who writes about UFOs, whose last name is Leak, which is actually Keel backwards. So I thought that was kind of neat. I don't know how many of you all have caught that while watching it, but he's actually two separate characters in the movie. But there's a line that I've always used that I love. John Keel's pretty much asking this Leak character, so what is it? What are we seeing? What is this thing? And he's just kind of like, we're not supposed to know. We're not allowed to know. And he's like, it'd be like you trying to explain yourself to a cockroach, is how he compares it in the movie. What they are trying to hide might be frightening, even incomprehensible to us, but it does seem that they are using us in some fashion. It may be more than a rumor that young people are being collected from college campuses after their memories of their families and friends have been altered, so that they will not remember the existence of these children. As far-fetched as this sounds, there may be more truth to it than to some of the other theories we are kicking around. We are being used in some fashion, and UFO intelligences don't want us to discover how they are using us. So all of this other stuff is camouflage, and I keep trying to peel away the layers of this camouflage. I keep trying to come up with something real and substantial. Perhaps if we could find out what they are doing to us, we could stop them. But once we found out what it was, they might stop on their own volition and do something else for a change. It may be the end of the game once we figure out what they are doing to us. Now, when we have a new UFO flap, such as the one going on at the moment, I ask myself, what is really going on? What are they covering up this time? What kind of manipulation is taking place that we don't know about? This is a very big flap because there is a lot of heavy news right now from the Middle East, and it should have smothered the UFO reports, but it didn't. There must be a lot of more UFO activity than the media have mentioned. 2 nights ago, the TV cameraman in a town near here spotted an object in the sky. He had a camera and he took pictures of it. He is a specialized cameraman, but when he developed the film, nothing came out on it. I have heard all this before. Were the objects really there, or were the witnesses just thinking they saw them? Or was the film manipulated in some way? Both possibilities are possible. McWayne. You seem to feel that the UFO phenomenon is a kind of delusion that is being perpetrated upon mankind by some unknown source. Keel. In an earlier time, when someone would undergo such experiences, people would say that he is enchanted. Today, people are still being enchanted, even though we don't use that terminology anymore. More and more people are accepting these incidences as real experiences, when they probably aren't. What we have had in the last 25 years or so is a large propaganda movement designed to create a whole frame of reference for these manifestations, a frame of reference that could be used to conceal and to cover up what is really going on. If it hadn't been for a relatively small handful of extraterrestrial enthusiasts, the concept of UFOs from outer space wouldn't have caught on, and the UFO intelligences would have had to find something else. But the outer space propaganda did catch on, and we have millions of people who accept extraterrestrial visitors as the explanation for the lights they are seeing in the sky. These UFO lights are appearing simultaneously in thousands of places all over the country. If it were really an invasion from outer space, it would be enormous. McWayne. Have you observed any new variations to the UFO sightings? Keel. This summer we had a great increase in phantom helicopters, which appeared in 20 states. These are unmarked helicopters of a very large size, and are usually compared to military helicopters. They are seen hovering over farm fields, so when farmers see them they think that they are cattle rustlers. So far, we do not have a single case in which the cattle were rustled when the helicopter was seen. Recently, new cases have started to erupt in New York State, but that they were mostly from California to Illinois. If you come across any news stories about helicopters, I would like to see copies. There is one other thing to keep on the alert for. I have come across 6 different cases in 6 different parts of the country in which exceptionally bright children from fairly poor families were given tests in schools which determined that these children were the brightest in their schools. These children who also claimed their family had a great deal of psychic ability. These children were approached by someone claiming to represent the U.S. government. These representatives, actually, Joseph, if you're listening, we were talking about this the other day. You were saying, how the government can't figure out spirituality. I wouldn't say that. I agree with you that they can't figure out spirituality, but I would say that they are trying to figure out psychic phenomenon and all that, but they're trying. What the government, I believe, is trying to do is militarize it. And like I was saying the other night, when I was talking to you on the phone, was they're militarizing psychics and stuff. People who can not astral project, but they call it pretty much when they visualize, and they can pretty much like map out where they are, and I forget what it's called, but the government's definitely playing around with psychic abilities and stuff, but they're trying to weaponize it and use it for evil, which government does that with anything, honestly. Anytime the government gets a hold of anything or invents anything, it's always militarized. Sadly. Let's see. These representatives made an offer that the government would finance their kids' college education if the children would sign an agreement that when they got out of college, they would automatically go into government service. Not military service, but government service. This seems to me to be a rather extraordinary program. Government does have programs to finance exceptional children with the agreement that the students will pay somehow after they get out of college. But I am aware of no deal wherein the students would have to go into the government when they get out to college. When I was in Washington, I decided to get to the bottom of this thing. I was with the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. I nosed around, and no one has ever heard of such a thing. I've tried to keep in touch with these 6 contacted families, but now I have lost communications with all of them. I would like to find out what has happened to them, or what will happen to them, when the kids are out of school. This doesn't sound like something the CIA would go in for. They are interested in certain psychological aspect of people, not intelligence. All these kids have is psychic ability. There are a lot of kids with high IQs, but who have not been approached. So psychic ability must be credential. Why do they single them out? Again, I ask, as with so many aspects of this phenomenon, just what is really going on? The October wave is actually part of the enormous 1972 to 73 flat, and is following to the letter the patterns of the previous waves. I expect the greatest peak to occur in March through April 1974. When that subsides, we will hear little about UFOs until 1978 to 1979. However, the next really significant wave will not take place until about 1984. By that time, a complete and rational explanation of the phenomenon will be common knowledge, and the whole delightful extraterrestrial concept will be a thing of the past. Thousands of people around the world now know all there is to know about the UFO phenomenon. Unfortunately, very few Americans are in this group because they have been misled for years by fanciful speculations, deliberately misleading manifestations, and chimeras, dark suspicions of mythical conspiracies, and most of all, fanatical emotionalism. Essentially, the phenomenon can be divided into two parts. The meandering nocturnal lights are the real mystery and still remain unexplained by astronomy. The objects and apparitions seen on the ground or close to it comprise the second part. These range from complex hallucinations to elaborate transmogrifications. Sorry, that's a hard word. Other accompanied by incredible distortions of reality and manipulations of time and space. Such manifestations have been known and recorded throughout history, and their true nature was recognized and defined thousands of years ago. Collectively, American ufologists are ill-informed and poorly educated in history, philosophy, and behavioral science, so they have failed to recognize what has actually happened, in contrast to what they think is happening. Ufology is essentially a new system of belief, not a new system of scientific fact. As such, it is no more substantive than the study of angels and the medieval cataloging of chimeras. Indeed, the deeper one penetrates into ufological problems, the more he finds himself rediscovering Heraclitus. So that's crazy, y'all. There's the man's words himself, the man, the myth, the legend, John A. Keel. Like I said, I plan to, for future podcasts, doing an episode on John A. Keel's Mothman prophecies. That's the only book I've ever read. I've seen other books of his, but I haven't really had the money to get them. I would like to, but I got a little ghost story for you all too. I'll end it on a ghost story. This is The Thing in the Well. Old Fort Niagara, Youngstown, New York. When the moon is full above the castle on a summer night, that is when they say it happens. And for all we know, it may be happening tonight. Pray it won't, or pray at least that neither you nor I will be there to see if it should. But wait, in my horror I am getting ahead of myself. Old Fort Niagara at Youngstown, New York is one of the northernmost historic sites of the United States. The impressive French castle, as it's called, was erected in 1726. These fortifications, which guarded the vital water route to the west, were occupied at various times by French voyagers. British grenadiers and American soldiers have been well preserved. Today the castle is just as it stood before the Revolution, with its massive stone walls and bastions, blockhouses and stockade, moat and drawbridge. In the summer months, the roar of muskets and the roar of drums reverberate beside Lake Ontario as colorful pageantry celebrates the history of the old fortifications. Most military forts have seen both good and evil days, just as the body of a murdered man sometimes rises to surface out of the water to expose his murderer. Dark deeds that once took place here persist among legends surrounding Old Fort Niagara. One grisly event continues to be told. Our story begins in the days just before the Indian War, when two French soldiers, whom we shall call Henri Leclerc and Jean-Claude de Rochefort, were stationed here. The fort in which they lived was a little city in itself, the largest place on the south of Montreal and west of Albany. Everything that these soldiers needed for daily life was here. They had a mess hall, barracks, bakery, blacksmith shop, and for worship a small chapel with a large ancient dial over the door to mark the hourly courses of the sun. The well in the center of the castle was there in the event the fort was ever surrounded and besieged. After the British capture and occupied it in 1759, they feared the French might have poisoned the water. So they filled the well with dirt and covered the top with large flat stones that matched the rest of the floor. It was not until the 1920s that the well was restored. In those early years, a burial ground lay just outside the massive gates, and over its entrance was painted in large characters the word rest. Just how some of those poor wretches were sent to their rest in this barren field is open to speculation. Undoubtedly there were those who came straight from the dungeon to the burial ground, for this fort also served as a harsh prison. The dungeon was called the Black Hole. It was a dark and dismal place. Over in one corner was a barbarous apparatus used for strangling those who offended the despotic rulers of a time when both justice and mercy were in short supply. On the dungeon's walls, from the top to bottom, prisoners had laboriously carved their names, a few pitiful words or a family emblem. Imagine the distress of one merchant at the fort who decided to hide some valuables in the dungeon when an attack was expected by superior British forces. He went there late one night, and on the wall, from among hundreds of French names, one leapt out at him. It was his own family name, D'Artagnan, carved in large letters. Once the bones of a woman were found when it became necessary to clear out an old mess hall sink, confirming people's suspicions that the fort was often the scene of a foul murder. Thus, amid the natural beauty of the land and the lake, it is clear that most of the atrocious crimes also took place in Old Fort Niagara. But let us return to our story. During any occupation, there is need for celebrations to break the monotony, and the French often held parties on the third floor of the castle. It was the custom of the officers to invite a number of Indian girls from the nearby Seneca village. Among the Senecas, women had considerable power and were respected. They both nominated members of the tribal council and removed them if they misbehaved. Henry Leclerc, a young man of a good family from Bordeaux, France, had left early on the evening of the party with several fellow officers to escort the women to the castle. Henry had personal reasons for going, as his heart had been captured by a lovely Indian girl named Oneida. They had no sooner arrived at the Seneca village, however, than a cloudburst occurred, and no one wanted to leave until it was over. On the return to the castle, the sky was clear and the night was beautiful, complete with an enormous full moon. Henry and Oneida lingered a little behind the others, admiring the moon and happy in each other's company. By the time the girls and their escorts reached the castle, the wine was flowing freely, for Henry could hear loud talk and outbursts of laughter as they mounted the stairs to the third floor. "The party is already quite noisy," remarked Oneida. Henry agreed. "If some of the men begin to get out of hand, I'll take you back to the village early," he said. When the girls entered the room, cheers rang out. For a time there was singing and dancing, and all went well. Unfortunately, an officer named Jean-Claude de Rochefort, whom Henry particularly despised, had pulled up a chair and seated himself on the other side of Oneida. Jean-Claude was a former seaman, and if he had not once been a pirate, Henry was certain he was at least a scoundrel. Jean-Claude also fancied himself irresistible to the ladies. all efforts that Henry and Oneida made at conversation were futile, for Jean-Claude constantly interrupted. With more wine, his behavior worsened. Several times Oneida shook de Rochefort's hand from her arm, but he continued to become even bolder. "Mon petit chou, why do you resist me?" he said, placing his arm around her shoulders and attempting to pull her close. "Because you are a pig," the angry young woman shot back at him. "Why, you little—" shouted Jean-Claude, seizing her roughly and thrusting his face close to hers. Henry jumped from his chair and struck Jean-Claude's face with such a blow that it released the girl in surprise. There was the thud of fists striking flesh and bone. Jean-Claude was getting much the worst of it. He leapt behind a chair and, to the other officer's surprise, drew his sword. Henry had to retreat enough to draw his own weapon. Henry thrust repeatedly at his attacker, and the greater amount of wine that Jean-Claude had consumed was now giving Henry the advantage. The blade of Henry's sword nicked de Rochefort's arm, then his cheek. Other officers at first tried to stop them, but then assumed that the duel would end when one or the other was wounded. Jean-Claude was always volatile, but tonight his temper combined with alcohol and the insult to his pride had sent him into a frenzy. Henry had the skill and ability to outlast his foe, however, and the other officers knew it. He withstood the mighty slashing blows that deflected his skillful thrust and avoided return lunges by stepping from one side to the other to tire his enemy. Henry moved to keep from backing into one of the Indian girls, and then he realized his danger. He was directly in front of the stairway. Seizing his advantage, Jean-Claude lunged forward with a quick thrust to the body, and involuntarily Henry stepped back to the brink of the top stair. Now Henry's peril was great, and Jean-Claude became even more reckless. He took a cut across the chin and charged forward with his body like a bull, as if to grab Henry about the waist and hurl him down the stairs. Jean-Claude was a brute of a man, and to avoid grappling with him, Henry moved backward down the stairs. His only hope was to keep Jean-Claude at a safe distance with the rapier sharp point of his sword, and try for a mortal thrust to the fellow's heart or abdomen. To this end he slowly retreated down the stairs, waiting for the right moment to deliver the blow. As it seemed that the duel would be a long one, the other officers stayed on the third floor with the Indian girls. The duelists continued down the flight of stairs until they were a short distance from the first floor. Henry then began to formulate a more charitable plan. Being the more agile man, when both reached the first floor, he would whirl around, mount a few steps, and leap upon Jean-Claude, pinning him to the floor. If he could execute the move quickly enough, he was sure his opponent would admit defeat. But as Henry's foot reached the third step from the bottom, he tripped and lost his balance. His head struck the stone floor and all went black. In a moment of insane anger, Jean-Claude raised his sword arm and ran the helpless man through. A little sanity, or at least the need for self-preservation, then began to return to Jean-Claude de Rochefort. He had committed murder, a deed for which he could hang. Before his crime was discovered, he must somehow get rid of the body. Henry was by no means a small man and would be too heavy to carry. Besides, Jean-Claude had only a short time to dispose of the evidence. What was he to do? He decided to dismember the body and to throw the pieces into Lake Ontario. If they were found later, everyone would think the soldier had been the victim of hostile Indians. He began his grisly work using his already bloodied sword. He first cut off the head and ran with it to the lake. Returning, he noticed the blood he had left on the floor, and finding some rags, mopped it up quickly. Ready to resume his horrible task, he heard the sound of voices from above and realized that the party was ending. The officers and the girls would be coming down the stairs at any moment. There was only one thing to do. With all his strength, Jean-Claude carried the body to the well and threw it in. From the depths of the well came a distant splash, and it was done. The party-goers stumbled back to their barracks in a much more drunken condition than the one in which they had arrived. If there were any who had wondered about Henry and Jean-Claude, they probably thought both men had retired to their own quarters. Within the week, some of the officers noticed the absence of Henry, and a search was organized, but it was fruitless. There were those, including Oneida, who were convinced that Henry had been murdered by Jean-Claude, but they lacked the evidence with which to step forward and accuse him. Oneida was certain that Henry was dead, for she knew he would have come back to her if he had been alive. Several months passed, and she did not have the heart to go to any parties at the castle. But one September night, when there was a party, she decided to go for the purpose of listening and learning whatever she could that might give her some clue to Henry's fate. The girls and officers left the village together, and some were surprised to see Oneida, for she had not been to the castle since the duel. That night she made it a point to mingle with as many of the officers as possible, but not to become deeply involved in conversation with any one of them. Her objective was to find someone who was a friend of Henry's and who had been there the night he disappeared. The evening passed, but she was not successful. Finally, as she was preparing to leave with the other girls, a young man named Jacques came up and spoke to her admiringly. "I know you. You were with Henry the night of the duel. I often admired you, but Henry was my dear friend, and I knew how much he cared about you. Your name was on his lips often." "Thank you. Perhaps I shall see you again at the castle." Jacques nodded, his face flushed with pleasure. 2 weeks later, Jacques went to the Seneca village. It was on a night when the moon was huge and round, with a cast to it, sometimes described as blood on the moon. However often we see it, there is always something ominous about a full moon that is red. Jacques and Oneida sat talking with some of the other members of the tribe, and this time it was Oneida who brought the subject around to Henry. But Jacques stopped her. "Oneida, it is not wise for us to say much about it here. Let's go to the castle." The building was empty, for it was by now almost midnight, and the men were in the barracks. They sat down on the bottom step of the same stairs where the duel had occurred, and Jacques began to tell how he lingered after the others had left the night of the duel. "I don't know what I expected. Perhaps that Henry could come back, but he did not. I sat right where we are now, and what happened? I thought I heard a noise coming from the well." "What did you do?" "I ran, that's what I did." Oneida looked at him accusingly. "And later you began to think that Jean-Claude might have killed him and put his body in the well, is that right?" "Yes, I thought of that, and also that he might not have been dead. Perhaps I could save his life." They both fell silent. It was almost midnight. Time to take Oneida back to the village, thought Jacques. "Hush! Do you hear something?" Oneida whispered. "Yes, like something scraping against stone." "Do you know where it is coming from?" "My God! Do you mean the well?" "Yes." The clock struck midnight, and then as the pair watched, horror-stricken, the fingers of a blood-stained hand crept very slowly over the side of the well. A second hand scrabbled over the rim. Now the forearms of a man emerged, dressed in a soldier's uniform. The arms appeared to pull mightily, and as they did, the shoulders and upper portion of a man's body rose out of the well, where the neck and head should have been, though there was nothing at all, only a bloody stump. Jacques and Oneida fled, terrified. There was no doubt in their minds that Jean-Claude had murdered Henry and dropped his headless body into the well. Nor did Jacques keep what he had seen a secret. The well was explored, the body of the dead man was found, and Jean-Claude was hanged. But those who have been there when the moon is full high over the castle say that exactly at midnight the ghost of the headless Frenchman begins to claw its way slowly but surely out of the well. After resting from its efforts, the ghost of Henry Leclerc rises, dripping, and moves slowly and awkwardly through the dark halls of the castle in search of its long-lost head. I don't know, that sounds pretty cool. If you're ever interested in ghost hunting that area to try and see if you can find the ghost of the headless Frenchman, it's located at Old Fort Niagara. It's a state historic site opened by Old Fort Niagara Association Incorporated in cooperation with the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. The address is Old Fort Niagara State Park, Youngstown, New York, 14174. The telephone number is 716-745-7611. Tours are conducted throughout the year. But thank you all for listening. I hope that you all have a good day. Like I said, now that I got my own place and stuff, I can do longer episodes. So this one almost made it an hour. So I hope you all enjoyed. Like and subscribe. Share if you want. Comment. And you all have a good day.
We are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings, secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.